Welcome to another episode of Legal for Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice at this point. This is always Rosie. It's always me here. And as I've said many, many times, we are just a group of students and young professionals who are very interested in technology and, yes, its regulation. So, today I am joined by another Giacomo, incredibly so. Hi, Giacomo. How are you?
You recognize my voice. Hello, Rosie. Nice to join
Yeah.
you.
For their joy, they do recognize your voice. That said, we actually have a very special guest today, someone that we've actually met at the Privacy Symposium in Venice, to which we've been invited and we really loved going to. Hello, Alexandre Jotterand.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
It's a great pleasure to see you in person, not in person again. But anyways, we lose track of time here. Um, that said, I really need you to tell all of our listeners what you were doing at the Privacy Symposium in Venice, why you're here today, and where did your career bring you? Why you're in this path?
Sure. So my name is Alexandre Jotterand, and I'm a lawyer specializing in technology and innovation. I'm based in Switzerland, which means that I either advise Swiss companies or European companies or companies that are active in Europe. And my field of expertise includes everything that's technology related, and of course, since now a lot of years. Privacy has been kind of the center of the regular, or I would say until 2023, privacy was really at the center of the regulation of technology. Maybe we'll have time to discuss of other topics. And that's basically what brought me a few weeks ago to the Privacy Symposium, where I was invited to speak on a panel regarding anonymization, pseudonymization, and synthetic data. I was invited to that specific panel because in Switzerland I've been quite active, and I've been very lucky of that in the research industry, specifically for the public sector, where I helped universities, research centers, and public and private organizations organize data schemes in order to facilitate the research. And in this context, it's really important to understand what data you are using, how do they qualify under the law, what are the obligations that are related to that. And that brought me into specializing in this very specific I would say, niche topic of privacy.
Before we start and we get straight to the point of what is synthetic data, let's talk about ID East. Your motto is turning legal complexity into actionable decision. What do you mean by that? Why isn't ID East an ordinary law firm?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. So, first of all, I think that the motto is as much for the clients than for me. It's something that I like, remembering, because it's important to make sure that whatever we do, we are here to simplify, clarify, and enable other people, generally inventive people, in doing what they do best. So in fields where the regulation can be really, really, complex, there is a lot, it overlaps, it has not been well thought. I think that the job of a lawyer is really to make sure that you can start from the regulation, understand the problem, and together find a pathway, probably not a solution, but just a pathway, so we know where we're going and we have understood that. And that's actually really at the core and the center of IDEST Avoca. So IDEST is a Latin word. We use it a lot in contracts, in English contracts, i.e., and it's used to explain that we will clarify the concept of what we were just saying. And that's actually what we try to do all the time. So we are not here only to bring you the legal answer, but to explain really what does it mean for you in your industry and what you can do with that information.
So let's try to make easy a concept that apparently is so hard to understand for us. What is synthetic data? in which context is relevant, and how it's created.
Yeah, so synthetic data in itself, it's very easy. It's data that has been created artificially. So anything that does not come from the real world, that's not an observation of the real world, it is synthetic data. It's different than digital data, because digital data is any information represented a fact that's registered in a digital manner, but it's something that's artificially created. Now you spoke about the context, because here also it's important to just remember, and specifically if your audience is more privacy centric, that actually there are different meanings and understanding of the concept. So when we are talking between privacy experts on synthetic data, we see that just as a privacy preserving technique. So it's a way to ensure that we basically have less problem regarding personal data regulations, because we will hope that the data is not personal data. I think we're going to come back to that. But it also has different meanings. In fact, in data forensics, it's a very specific thing, and it's sometimes very useful to just artificially create data to test hypotheses. And now that we are talking a lot about Gen AI, so Gen AI is basically creating synthetic data all the time. And we use a lot of synthetic data in the context of creating the models. We maybe also be able to come back to that. But everything that is generated by AI is synthetic data. And that also raises questions, because we end up in a world on the internet where most of the data that we can find is actually artificially created. So always good to keep in mind when we are talking about synthetic data. I think we're going to delve a little bit more into the privacy aspect. So really what we want to do with that, the area where it's on purpose that we are creating synthetic data to solve very important privacy issues in order, for instance, to facilitate research. But just keep in mind that we have different aspects of synthetic data and that it can be used in different situations. If you allow me one example, so if we are going back to AI, and I guess we're gonna speak a lot about AI, but actually, so the way the new AI models, the giants that we are using, they not only rely on synthetic data, but actually how they perform. So you have two competing models, one that creates synthetic data, and the other one which is responsible for telling whether or not it can recognize that it's synthetic data. And that's the way it's got so good. So we are not talking about the need to preserve privacy rights or anything. We are using synthetic data for a very different purpose. And if we are talking now about privacy preserving methods, so here it's really the idea, and that's, as I mentioned, the thing that most people will think about when we are talking about synthetic data, but it's the idea that we can have a data set that contains personal data, and it will have there is information that you can extract from these data sets without needing any personal data. So you will only take the statistical value of the data, and you will reproduce that in a new data set artificially created that will not be about Bob and Alice, but that will contain the same information in relation to each of them. And that will be the way we create synthetic data for the purpose of solving privacy issues.
However, we know that there are a lot of shades between personal data and synthetic data. So we know that synthetic data, as you've said, are basically generated. They're not made by human and not related to the human. But I mean, everywhere we read now, anonymized, pseudonymized, then there's synthetic data, then there's personal data, then there's relatable data. How how would you put these definitions in a framework so that our listeners and ourselves, because we need help, can understand which one as a solution is better to be used in specific models, for example? Like, what's the difference and why do we have all of these shades and not just one type of data?
Yeah, so maybe to answer your questions, the first part of the reflection is to come back to the definition of personal data. So if we are in the discussions regarding I want to create synthetic data in order to solve privacy issues, then we need to come back to what is personal data. So there is a very clear definition in the law. It's similar, at least in Europe. And personal data is data that is related to an individual that is identified or identifiable. And therefore, there are four components of a thing being called personal data. You need a piece of information, you need a natural person, you need a link between both, so the information needs to relate to, and the person needs to be at least identifiable. If you remove the last part, the identification part, then you have anonymized data or pseudonymized data. So you have data, but it's not possible to make the link with the person because the person is not identifiable. If you remove the third part, which is the related to, then you get synthetic data because you have data which actually looks like personal data, but it does not relate to actually any existing individual. So that's the theory. In reality, it's a bit more complex because your synthetic data can be personal data, can be pseudonymized data, or can be anonymized or anonymous data. So anonymized data is personal data that you have made anonymous, and anonymous data could be actually, meteorological data, any information about buildings, anything that does not relate to any individual, then it's just anonymous data. And yeah, the question that will be very complex to answer, and that is always very complex, is to understand, well, but what are the threshold that we need to apply in order to understand whether you are in one special category or the other. And I can give you that because I'm sure it's going to be interesting to everyone. So first of all, we don't really have definitions in the law about what is pseudonymized or anonymized data. There is one recital in the GDPR that gives us a little bit of idea about that, but we don't have any concrete information. What we know is the concept of pseudonymization. So it's the act of removing identifiers, so things that, for instance, my name or my date of birth, and in order to have at the end pseudonymized data. The big question and well, let's start by the difference between anonymized and pseudonymized, and then we'll get back to the real question. So if I just remove the identifiers, but I keep the code that's required to identify the data or the individuals, then I have pseudonymized data. And if I completely destroy the link between the data and the individuals, I have anonymized data. So that seems easy in theory. In practice, the big question that we have is the sharing of data between different persons, or where the information the additional information that is required to re-identify individuals in a data set that has been de-identified, that can be any process, and that includes pseudonymization, anonymization, or the creation of synthetic data. You de-identify, and at the end, the question is, well, can I still link this information to a person? And the real complex question, especially when you are talking with different actors collaborating, is, but whose point of view should we take into account? Whose information should we take into account? Is it sufficient if anybody anywhere in the world is able to identify the individuals, or do we have to take a smaller group? And that's the really complex question on this topic.
Wow, it sounds super difficult to understand. And I think, like, as you said, like these questions are asked at, for example, company level, at law level, but then you also have the judgments of the courts, which you cannot kind of foresee before they happen. So I can imagine the uncertainty in implementing and giving specific advice when you don't know when then, like, which side the court is going to go through. Like, if they're going to say like a bigger group of people or a smaller group of people. So like my question then links to our kind of like train of thoughts and is like, if there is so much uncertainty on definition, as you said, there is no stable definition, there are hints here and there in the GDPR, but it doesn't look like a specific, dictate. um and then there's the legal practice, there's the interest of a company, of course, because data is valuable. And then there's the possibility that all of this kind of framework is completely shaken by a court decision. Do you see the GDPR framework as being helpful in protecting privacy and literally the data, the personal data of people, or is it more a you know just something where compliance is difficult? It's just an earth shaker to a situation that would probably be okay. Like, who cares if they've got my data anyways, no?
Yeah, that's a very almost philosophical question, I guess. For the list, it's very political. So you're well aware that we have different regulation in the world, and that the European Union is regulating a bit more than other countries. Some people consider that it's absolutely required in order to protect privacy rights, individuals' rights, etc., and other things that is detrimental to both economic growth, but also things like advancing science. And I was reading a paper just a few weeks ago, I think last week, and it was really revealing. So they assessed the use of anonymized data for the purpose of scientific research. And then they assessed exactly which teams from which country declared that they were using anonymized data sets and from where these anonymized data sets were coming. And the overall result was very clear. So in Europe, researchers were really reluctant on using anonymized data sets for what we can assume is privacy risk questions, as you clearly mentioned, and that's very accurate, Rosalia. It's never clear whether or not what you are using fall into one category or the other. So there is doubt, there is risks. And if you want to do the things correctly, then you will probably end up not using the anonymized data sets because you're not sure you can use it in conformance with the law applicable to you. And as a result, there is a lot of information and data sets that European researchers are not using because they consider, apparently, I can only assume that they consider it's either not valid or it's a risk. Where in the US, they have, when we are talking about medical data and research, they have a very specific test. They can apply actually two tests. And based on that, they can have certainty that, well, they can consider the data as anonymized or de-identified, as the term, and they can use it. So I will agree with you that in some cases, it's very, so I will be very careful with what I'm going to say, because I'm not saying that we don't need privacy rules. I think they are very important, but there are clearly some situations where the balance of interest would go into further facilitating the secondary use of data specifically for research purposes. And even if there are possibilities available in Europe, it is made so complicated that most of the time we end up only using data for which we've collected clear consent, and very often with different consent form for different countries. So it's detrimental to research and scientific results in general.
I think the big question around AI is which data is used. What means would you deploy to make sure that data is used, kept in compliance with privacy and data protection law?
Yeah, so AI poses a lot of questions regarding personal data. That is for sure, and they are not yet answered. So we know that the models that we are using every day and that we all think are very useful have been trained on possibly every data available online, and they really did not care that much whether or not it was personal data or it was copyright protected data. Once all the models were trained, the EDPB issued guidelines on what you can do or not with that. And it's a very interesting read, but at the end of the day, what I can read is that, well, there is no clear answer. We don't know for sure. It all depends on the situation, and it probably won't change much for the time being. So we have this enormous discussion about the training parts for personal data, and I don't think we're very close to have an answer, and we're in a situation where companies outside of Europe, they don't really care and they're using it, and inside of Europe they'll be very more cautious and will probably not use it. If I may have one other topic that I think is worth mentioning about the concept of synthetic data and AI. So synthetic data, as I mentioned, is any data that is basically AI generated. And I also mentioned that anything that's come out of the AI models is also synthetic data. And what we can have from these models is information that is just false. So you can generate information that could be about me or even refers to me very specifically. And the question is whether or not this should be considered personal data or not. Because it's synthetic data. It's not data relating to me, but there is a link between me and this data. If I take an example, maybe an AI model would say that Alexandre Jotterand is a Harvard law professor, which I wish, but I'm not yet. And is this information personal data? Another example is deepfakes. So basically, AI models are used to create deepfakes, or can be used. That's very detrimental. That's an issue. It's also a question of synthetic data, actually. And there has been persons stating that this should not be considered personal data because it's not really it's not a real information. It's a made-up information. For me, it is clear that as long as it can have an effect on me, it should be considered personal data. But it's also a controversial aspect that we have around AI. So we have in the training phase, in the input phase, and also in the output phase questions regarding personal data and including synthetic data.
Because if I'm not wrong, the outcome that the AI will give to us is the one that statistically could be closer to what we are trying to have. So at that point, not be personal data. I get the point. Okay.
Yeah,
So
we have the same with copyright, actually. So the AI provider, they say, well, but we don't actually have a copy of your artwork. We have neural networks and links with weights, and only if it asks in a certain ways can we actually generate the outputs that will be so. But at the end of the day, sometimes it's possible to recreate verbatim copies of the original data. And sometimes it's actually not a verbatim copy. Maybe it's entirely made up, but it can also have impact on me. And I think it should be taken into account.
I mean, that's super interesting because there's a case being litigated, I think, in Norway right now about a person who found out that ChatGPT thought that he had killed two of his sons and was going to kill the third one. And I mean, any one of his neighbors could have looked for that information and found out that this guy, who's apparently a very nice person as well, was potentially a three times murderer. And I mean that's not none of your business is litigating
Yeah, yeah, I remember.
the case, and I mean that's the point. Like, to what extent can the generative AI company be liable for something that's, they say it's synthetic, like it's something not related to personal data, it's something they found by scraping on the internet, and it's something that was created by the kind of generative AI model, but at the same level, I mean, I don't know if, I don't know, Bluebird can say like, I'm gonna sue Perrault because they depicted me awfully, but that's just a fable. But when it's a human being, when it's a person, like, to what extent can a defamation case hold? No? So
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think this is very interesting to look at this aspect of synthetic data. So synthetic data as the output of Gen AI models, and reconsider all the questions that we had in the past regarding the creation of synthetic data for privacy preserving ends. So if I'm creating a synthetic data set, I will also have the same thing. So basically, the data will not be exactly the same, but maybe there is still links that can be made about me. They're entirely fake, but is it relevant or not for personal data? And I think it's exactly the same question, just on two different aspects or consideration of the same case.
just one last question, I promise. It's about what you said about the EDPB kind of like letting the training happen and then waking up with a very, very interesting opinion that is just, unfortunately, an opinion, because if something has already happened, you can just have an opinion on it. You can't have a real action about it. Um, it seemed to hint that perhaps there was some careful waiting in the kind of meantime area, so to allow some kind of progress to happen, even through and with and thanks to Europe, I would say. Um, you reside in Switzerland, and Switzerland is quite famous, at least from our European perspective, for being a very, very interesting and super cool hub of technology, despite the fact that you do abide to some of the European laws. I mean, the GDPR is applicable in Switzerland as well. So, how did Switzerland make this magic? Why isn't it enough that the EDPB waits a second and lets technology take its time to evolve? But Switzerland, which kind of does the same, still feels like it's 1,000 years ahead of Europe.
Yeah, well, it's probably a question too complex for me to answer. So the reasons why indeed Switzerland is a very innovative country. I think every year we praise ourselves from being, at the top of this innovation ranking for countries, although we are very small. Um, I don't really have the answer whether it's entirely about culture, regulation, economics. It's a mix of that. I would, however, just correct you a little bit on the fact that we have the same regulations, because we don't actually. So we do apply GDPR. GDPR is not directly applicable in Switzerland because we're not in the EU in itself. We can only be subject to the GDPR because of its extraterritorial reach, which is very often the case. So a lot of European companies need to abide by it, but I would say they are not as much as afraid as would a European company be, because there has never been so far a fine that has been issued and levied against on basis of the GDPR against a Swiss company. So international enforcements can be an issue. And then on the new regulations of the digital sector in Europe, the Switzerland has not followed yet. And I do think there's really some aspects where they should have. I think on platform regulation, we are really lagging behind. I do think that on non-personal data sharing, which is another big interest of me, there would also be aspects where we should do more. But there is clearly also aspect where I believe the European Union has been just too far, too fast, and that's probably not a very good thing for innovation. And I see it. So I advise a lot of Swiss clients that want to sell their products or services in Europe, and just understanding which laws apply to them, what they need to take, what they need to include in their general terms and conditions, whether or not they need a local representative under the GDPR, under the Digital Services Act, the Digital Services Act, etc., etc. It's just so complex. I mean, it's just a very high burden for companies.
This is a very terrible question I'm going to ask, so I'm aware of it. Just bear with me. If you could scrap one single law in the European Union, which one do you think would be like this one?
But I don't think I would stripe just only one or one in entirely. So, well, I do think there is a lot of bad things with the EU AI Act, and except for Article 50, I don't really see the value in much of the 200 pages of the regulation. So that would be my first go-to.
Right, the whole EA Act. You went very light, I would say, in terms of.
I kept one provision.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, the balance is restored then.
Yes.
Well, well, then I shall ask the very last question, which is what we ask everyone. Do you have any suggestions of books, podcasts, TV series, anything that would help our listeners understand a bit better about this topic, or something that you really think they should come across? I mean, at least in their lifetime.
Yeah, so in terms of podcasts, there is your podcast that's really great. So I would advise everyone to really look at that. There is also Hard Fork, which is a US podcast by the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken. That's really good to yeah, be informed of what's going on in the tech sector in the US mainly. And the book I'm reading right now is Nexus, which is
Yeah.
really
No,
interesting and
no, of
really,
your.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, and which is really revealing on a lot of things that are happening currently in terms of the power of information.
Oh, I mean, I'm glad that we are on the same level as the New York Times. This is like, ooh.
Yeah, you're way above.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, this is very flattering, so thank you so much. And, and with all of that flatter, I will let Alexandre Jotterand go. And thank you so, so much for joining us today because this was absolutely incredible and we absolutely enjoyed meeting you once again after the Privacy Symposium in Venice.
It was very fun. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you so much.
you,
And thank you, Giacomo, as well, for joining me.
Rosie. Thank you, Alexander.
Bye.
Bye bye.